Hello everybody, my name's Lewis. I'm a lecturer at the University of East Anglia and I'm going to talk to you about some of the maths and statistics that are underlying the current outbreak of coronavirus. So we've all seen graphs and figures like this in the news over the past few weeks, and things do seem very bleak. And we are in the middle of a global pandemic in which many thousands of people have already died, and thousands more people are going to die. And so as a result, governments across the world are putting in place unprecedented measures to try to minimise the damage caused by coronavirus. Now, at the heart of these strategies are mathematical and statistical models. So in this lecture, I'd like to try and give an overview of some of the concepts behind this work and talk to you about some of that work. In terms of pitch, I've aimed this at my first year undergraduate students, but feel free to get in touch if anything's not clear. And it's worth saying now that if you're interested, below this video you'll find a link which will take you to the slides, which has got some notes and more information in it. And if you're interested, there's our markdown code that made the slides as well. So to give a talk outline, I'm going to start off by talking about a bit of background on COVID-19 and clearing up some terminology. Then we'll think about why the disease is spreading so rapidly and think about the problem of exponential growth. We will look at models and think about how we predict the consequences of COVID-19 and any interventions that we might want to make. Then we'll take a closer look at some of the more high-profile models of COVID-19 impacts. And we'll finish by thinking about how can we tell if any models that we make are likely to be accurate. So let's start at the beginning and ask this question of what is COVID-19? I think it's useful at this stage to define some terms so that we know what we're talking about. A lot of people, including me, use these terms interchangeably. That's okay. It's just useful to know what each term means. So, COVID-19 is not a virus, it's actually a disease. It's short for coronavirus disease 2019, and the name of the virus itself is SARS-CoV-2. That stands for Severe Acute Respiratory Syndrome Coronavirus 2, and so SARS-CoV-2 causes the disease COVID-19. The coronavirus then is just a general name for the group of viruses that include SARS-CoV-2. In fact, it's a genus. So, SARS-CoV-2 is the virus that causes COVID-19. It's what we call a positive sense single-stranded RNA virus. I'm not going to explain that all in detail, but it uses RNA rather than DNA, and by positive sense, that just means that the viruses can directly translate RNA sequence into viral proteins, and it doesn't need things like RNA polymerase. The closest relative of SARS-CoV-2 is a virus found in bats, hence you might have heard that this disease originated in bats. That's our best guess at the moment. But also it might have passed through an intermediate host, and one of the hypotheses is that it passed through pangolins before being transmitted to humans. But at the time of recording this, that's not clear. So SARS-CoV-2 causes the disease COVID-19. So the incubation period, that's the time from being infected to showing symptoms of COVID-19, is around 5 to 6 days, but it could be shorter or longer in some individuals. That becomes quite important later on, as we'll see. And so then when symptoms are onset, they include a fever, a cough, these are the most common ones, difficulties with breathing, and also some less common symptoms as well. In many cases, the symptoms are mild or even absent, and you might have heard about asymptomatic individuals. They almost certainly do occur. In what proportion, we're not yet sure. But in other cases, the disease can lead to pneumonia, organ failure, and death. So it's very severe. It's not just like the flu. It can be very unpleasant indeed. So why is COVID-19 spreading so fast? And it is spreading very fast, and these are the sorts of graphs that you'll be seeing in the news where we've had a relatively slow uptake of the disease and then suddenly it shoots up. It's the same if you look in more detail at the deaths as well. And what becomes quite clear then is we're not looking at a linear growth over time, we're looking at something called exponential growth. So this is a classic model of exponential growth, and in pandemic outbreaks, the early stages usually fit an exponential growth model. So what do we mean by exponential growth? Well, it's simply that the amount added to the curve, in this case at any point in time, is proportional to the amount already present. So the easiest thing that we can think of here is doubling rates, right? So a linear growth would be adding, say, 2 to a sequence every time, so 0, 2, 4, 6, 8, 10. An exponential growth would be if we're adding proportionally, so if we're doubling, so we're saying 2 goes to 4, 8, 16, 32, so on and so forth. So very quickly, under an exponential growth model, we can get very, very large numbers indeed. In terms of the things that affect the shape of an exponential growth curve, well, you've got to think about 3 things. The amount of starting material, say the amount of individuals that are infected when you start measuring. The growth rate, that's really important, so how much is added on each time, we'll think about that a bit later. And of course the amount of time that's gone by. Those are the 3 things that affect exponential growth. So why does diseases like COVID-19 grow exponentially? Well, here's a really nice illustration in the Washington Post. There's a link in the slides that accompany this talk. You can go there and have a look yourself. I'm going to take you there now. So, what the Washington Post have made here, and it's really nice, is a very simple individual-based model. We'll talk about those in a bit more detail later. But each dot on this screen is going to represent an individual. That individual is going to be moving about, and they can either be healthy, in this case the grey individuals, they could be sick, which is going to be brown, or they could have recovered, and they're going to be represented in pink. So when individuals make contact with each other, if we have a sick individual, then that's going to result in transmission of the disease, and that's going to mean more sick individuals. So let's have a look at those dynamics and how they change over time. So we're going to run a simulation. At the beginning then, we've just got a few sick individuals, but very quickly, the more sick individuals you get, the more contact there is, and suddenly the whole population becomes infected until people start recovering, and eventually the population recovers again. So you can see when we have a lot of sick individuals, there's a lot more contact that can be made, and hence the growth rate increases proportionately with the number of sick individuals. And that's why diseases grow exponentially. So it's worth pointing out at this stage that it's really important that you pay attention to the scale of any graph that shows the growth rate of a disease over time. And we'll illustrate this here just with 2 very simple graphs based on some made-up data that are showing the number of cases of a disease changing over time. So they're plotting exactly the same data, but they're shown on different scales. So on the left side, we've got a classic linear scale. On the right-hand side, the same data are plotted on the log 10 scale. And so what we can see then is when you view the data on a linear scale, you can see that there are very small numbers of cases early on, and then it shoots up at the end. When we view it on a log scale, so on that right-hand graph, what you can see the y-axis is going up from 10 to 100 to 1,000 to 10,000 to 100,000, that we get a straight line. And that's an important feature of exponential growth, is that if you visualize it on a log scale, you'll get a straight line. So this is really useful because we can get an easy estimate of growth rates. We can estimate the slope of that line, and that will tell us growth rates. So if we go back to this graph from the Financial Times, what you can see is that the y-axis is visualised on a log scale. In fact, it's on a log 2 scale. So if we look at the lines, for instance, for the UK, France and Spain, we can see that they're all straight lines, more or less. And so this tells us that the number of deaths is growing exponentially. They're not increasing gradually over time. In fact, they're growing in proportion to the number of cases that are already there. And also using the dotted lines, we can tell that the number of deaths in the UK, for instance, is doubling roughly every 2 days. And so these log scales give us a much easier way of determining if countries are on similar trajectories, especially if those countries are at different stages. And so when we sort of hear things like the UK being 14 days behind Italy, we can see that much more clearly thanks to plotting graphs on log scales. The author's got a really nice explanation of why he uses log scales on his Twitter account. I'll put the link to those tweets below in the slides to this video. Okay, so how do we predict the consequences of COVID-19? Well, as a starting point, I think we have to think about what it is exactly that we want to predict. Is it the number of people that are going to get infected? Is it the number of people with symptoms? Is it the number of people that are going to die? Is it the ability of a healthcare system to cope? We can potentially predict any one of those things or any combination of them, and we may want to, but it's important to bear in mind what exactly is the aim of any model before going about building it. So let's start taking a look at some of the sorts of models that epidemiologists are using to predict COVID-19 dynamics. So this first graph here is what you might see from a classic SIR model, which is commonly used in epidemiology. So it's a kind of what we call a compartment model, and that just means that the model divides the population up into groups. So it divides them up into individuals that are susceptible, so they're in blue here, those that are infected, they're in green, and those that are recovered, so they're in red. Hence SIR, susceptible, infected, recovered. So what we can see is that in this particular model here, we look at the blue line, the number of susceptible people is going to decrease over time. The green line, the number of infected people, that's going to increase and then decrease as people recover. And then finally, the red line shows the number of recovered people. That's obviously going to increase over time. So that SIR model is a kind of mathematical model, so it will be based on differential equations. The second kind of model that is becoming much more common is what we call an individual-based model. And you might hear these referred to as agent-based models. They're used across a lot of different sciences, including ecology, but also in things like economics as well. So in an individual-based model, each individual is simulated in order to predict population level effects. So this enables us to simulate quite complex individual level processes in a way that you can't easily do with a compartment model. So hence individual based models are becoming much more popular. But of course these models, when you're simulating lots of individuals, we have to make a lot of assumptions, and we'll talk about why this can be a problem a little bit later on. For now, I do just want to talk about one particular assumption that underpins a lot of epidemiological models, and that's this number R0. You can read a whole article about R0. Here's a really nice piece in The Atlantic by the excellent Ed Young. And it's worth understanding exactly what R0 is and why it matters. So R0 is often called the basic reproduction number. To define it, it's essentially the average number of people who will catch the disease from a single infected person in a population where everybody's susceptible. So it's how many people, if I'm infected with the disease, during the period where I'm infected, how many people am I going to infect? So that encapsulates a lot of different things. It encapsulates the mode of transmission, the amount of contact rates, the amount of people that I'm likely to see, and the duration of infection. It is an average number, so it summarises a distribution, and that distribution is important, right? So if most individuals don't infect very many other people, but a few individuals are kind of what we call super spreaders, that's different, say, to a population where everybody infects an intermediate number of people. It's also important to note that R0 isn't fixed, so it can change depending on the context, so such as behaviour. So social distancing, the aim of social distancing is to affect R0. It's difficult to estimate, and so different researchers can come up with different estimates of what R0 is. So that's really important. In terms of the growth rate, obviously, what R0 is it's the growth parameter on those exponential curves. It underpins a lot of how rapidly the disease will spread. So once we build a model, and it might be a compartment model or an individual-based model, looking at how a disease is likely to spread, what you can then do is take that model and simulate some sort of intervention. And one of the key aims of these interventions has been to flatten the curve. A lot of you will have seen that phrase. And what that is essentially is changing the shape of a histogram. So here is an example. You've seen lots of versions of this graph, I'm sure. This one is from The Guardian. If we take an instance where we've got no intervention, we have a much larger number of cases at a given point. Whereas if we flatten the curve and we spread those cases out, we get a reduced number overall, and more importantly, we don't exceed the capacity of a healthcare system. So what models aim to do is to simulate some sort of intervention and look at how that affects the shape of these curves. So now we understand how the basics of how these models work, we can take a look at some of the high-profile models of COVID-19. So I'm just going to go through two here of the most high-profile ones. So first we're going to be looking at the Imperial College model, and then a more recent model from Oxford University. Okay, so the Imperial College model here is a screenshot of the paper itself, taken by this large collaborative research group who are, a lot of who are involved in directly advising the British government. I'll put a link, you can read the paper, it's freely available online. I'll put a link to it on the slides. Key point is that, well, it's an individual-based model, which now we know what that is. It simulates individuals, and being an individual-based model, it of course has a lot of assumptions. That's not necessarily a bad thing, but we need to understand what those assumptions are. So this model was originally built to simulate influenza dynamics, and it takes individuals and simulates transmission among individuals. So to do that, you have to kind of generate a virtual world, basically. So this model simulates things like household sizes, school class sizes, workplaces, commuting distances, and people go to school, they go to work, and then the transmission of the disease is simulated in those contexts. So of course, what that affects is the contact rates of individuals. So how often are people seeing each other? That's a key element that is going to affect R0. So the authors assumed that there was an incubation period of the disease of 5.1 days. That was based on the best available evidence that they had. They assumed an R0 of 2.4 based on some estimates from the dynamics in Wuhan in China, but they did also look at a range of R0 values. They assumed that symptomatic individuals were 50% more infectious than asymptomatic ones. They assumed that there was short-term immunity, to reinfection. So if you've had it, then you can't get it straight away afterwards. There isn't, as far as I'm aware, any strong evidence that that's not the case. And then, in order to simulate the ability of the healthcare systems to cope, they had to look at hospitalisation rates and death rates. So these they simulated as being age structured, which is, from everything that we know about COVID-19, is correct. And so they assumed that young children, age 0 to 9, for instance, had 0.1% of patients needed hospitalisation, and that increases up to about 30% for people aged 80 plus. Similarly, the fatality rates that they assumed were structured by age, so very, very low fatality rates were assumed for young children, and just under 10% for people aged over 80. So these are the assumptions going into the model when they're predicting these things. So they simulate then a case of just what happens if we let the disease run unchecked, and then in addition to that, they simulate a bunch of MPI interventions, so non-pharmaceutical interventions. And there are 5 of these, and it's worth just going through them in detail. So first of all, they simulate just case isolation in the home. And so that's just what we're being advised to do, is that if once you start seeing symptoms, you stay at home for 7 days. And this reduces, they assume, the amount of contacts that you have with people outside your household. The second intervention that they simulated was voluntary home quarantine. So this is, if somebody in your house gets sick, then you quarantine for 14 days, which is, again, what we've been advised to do now. And they assume that only 50% of households are going to comply with this policy. And again, they assume that that's going to reduce your contact rates with people outside of your household, which is pretty logical, but that it will increase contact rates within the household. The third thing that the model simulates is the effects of social distancing of those aged 70 and over. So this, they assume, what happens if we would just reduce contacts by 50% in workplaces. So that again increases household contact rates and reduces other contact rates. And again, they assume a 75% compliance with the policy. Fourth thing was social distancing of everybody, in a similar way to social distancing of just people 70 and over. And then finally, they simulate the closure of schools and universities. So with every one of these, you have to make some assumptions, right? And it's not very clear from the paper itself exactly how these interventions were simulated, but the authors say that they use plausible and largely pessimistic assumptions about the impact of each intervention. So their argument is that they're being conservative here. So these are the results that directly from the paper. And again, you can go and read these yourself. But this is, the authors, what they've done is grouped their interventions into strategies associated with what they call mitigation and those associated with suppression. So this first figure here, this is figure 2 from the paper, is looking at the mitigation strategies. And this is what the UK government appeared to be thinking about a couple of weeks ago. They were thinking not so much about quarantine and lockdown and social distancing, but just about things like case isolation and household quarantine. So don't go out if you're infected, don't go out if somebody that you live with is infected. And here is the simulation of how many critical care beds will be occupied per 100,000 of the population. So we'll go through these curves in time. So this first one here, up the top, is what happens if we do nothing. And this, then the number of deaths that they predicted would occur is 510,000 people if we do nothing. And that is actually a conservative estimate, because that's assuming that all of those people could receive care if needed, so that the healthcare system was able to cope. This next one here then is just closing schools and universities without doing anything else, without case isolation or anything else. This one here is what happens if we just say stay in if you've got symptoms. This one here is what happens if we say you and anybody in your house stay in if anybody's got symptoms. And this one here is what happens if we do stay in if you have symptoms or anybody in your house has symptoms. And also social distancing just among the elderly, which again was what it appears was the UK government's strategy early on. Now we can see that these things do have an effect, but key here is this red line, and this is the capacity of the healthcare system. So what we can see is that although these interventions have an effect, it's nowhere near enough to get below the level at which the healthcare system can cope. And all of these scenarios resulted in the healthcare system getting overwhelmed and many, many thousands of people dying. And so it's likely that for this reason, as a result of this model, the government appeared to change its strategy. So here is now the graphs of the suppression strategies. So here we're thinking about things like social distancing. And this is actually the same graph, just viewed on two different scales. And so what we have here then, this first peak, is what happens if we do nothing. So again, we have this overwhelming of the healthcare system. And then in the other instances, we've got a scenario of isolating people, quarantining households if people show symptoms, and general social distancing. And that's this brown graph here. So what we see is that we don't get a peak at all during May, June, if this is effective. And this is the zoomed in at that area, and that we're within the ability of the healthcare system to cope. If the other scenario they modelled was school closure, so school and university closure and case isolation without household quarantine and general social distancing. And again, we see that the peaks are nowhere near as bad in the spring and summer. But, of course, what we see in these scenarios is that actually there are these peaks in the autumn and winter. So if everybody's shut down now, the virus doesn't go away, we get let out again in the summer, and the disease comes back in the autumn or the winter and is potentially just as bad. Again, this is assuming that, though, that we do nothing in the autumn and winter. Clearly then, the government has opted for preventing deaths in the short term as the preferable strategy, and that seems very sensible. It is worth noticing that the paper did actually look at kind of longer term scenarios. And so what they did was simulated a policy where suppression was used in a kind of dynamic manner. So there's a kind of trigger point where once you get a certain number of cases, we start social isolation. And if you do that, what the authors showed was that you can keep the disease at bay, but social distancing would need to be in place for 2/3 of the time. And that would be the case until a vaccine is available. So that's the main model on which the government are basing their advice. Now, clearly there are a lot of assumptions, but as the authors say, they seem to be fairly conservative in those assumptions. Just want to talk about one more model, mainly because it's generated some headlines that appeared to completely contradict the Imperial study, and it's caused some people to kind of claim that the government interventions in the UK and elsewhere were over the top. So we've seen headlines like this. This was in the Financial Times, saying that coronavirus may have infected half of the population already. Oxford study. So again, you can find this model online. I'll put the link in with the slides. This is by a very well-known group at the University of Oxford, in the Department of Zoology. It's worth noticing the title actually. It's what they say is that the fundamental principles of epidemic spread highlight the immediate need for large-scale serological surveys. So we'll talk about what they are in a bit. But it's not making any claims about how many people are infected. So just a few details about this model. So this is called a Bayesian model. I'm not going to go into the details of what that is. It's a slightly different way of doing statistics than a lot of you may have been taught in school or university. Again, it has assumptions. It's an SIR model, so it's a mathematical model rather than an individual-based model. And what the model does is varies two key parameters. So it varied R0, which is the kind of spread rate of the disease, and it varied this parameter called rho as well, which is the proportion of the population at risk of the severe disease. So what they kind of wanted to know was, have we got a very infectious but mild disease, or have we got a less infectious but more severe disease? And if we make assumptions about those things, what does that tell us about death rates? So the model looked at three different scenarios where it varied R0 and rho. And it compared the number of deaths predicted by the model to those observed in the UK and in Italy. So it's actually trying to see if the model can predict the observed data, and in this case, the number of deaths. So here's the main result from the Oxford model. And I think the key thing to look at is up here. So the dots here are the data of the UK death rate. And then actually underneath those, there are three lines: a grey line, a green line, and a red line. And what the authors show then is that all three of their scenarios fit the observed data. So what that means is that you could get the patterns that we've observed in terms of the number of deaths accumulating over time with both lots of infections and low severity, or with a few infections and high severity. Now the model, this is really important, doesn't suggest which one of these scenarios is more likely, and really importantly, all of the available evidence suggests that this parameter rho is reasonably high, so much higher than 0.1%. So what the second graph here then is, what this shows is that in a scenario, if rho was very low, then that would suggest that 50% of the population is already infected. Now that's very unlikely to be the case, and it's very unlikely that 50% of the population is already infected, and that's not actually a claim of the study. So those headlines were misleading, and I think there's an interesting lesson here about how these sort of data are presented to the media. Okay, so just to finish up, I'm going to talk about how we can tell if models are likely to be accurate. So all of the assumptions that underlie things like R0 and the models in general need data to back them up, right? So if we make an assumption about the spread rate of the disease, that has to be based on some sort of data. And at the moment, the data that we have isn't great. So the models are having to, at least to some degree, operate on guesswork. There's a really good Guardian article, I'll put the link in, that exposes some of the problems and pitfalls of modelling. That's not to say that modelling isn't useful, it's absolutely essential, but that we have to be aware of its limitations. And most importantly, models need data to back them up. So how do we start getting those data? Well, I think the main way and the most important way that we can move forward with this is through testing and mass testing. Why should we be testing? Well, several reasons. From a practical perspective, testing allows us to isolate cases. So if you are unwell, you know that you've got the disease, you can stay at home, those in your family can stay at home. It can also allow people back to work if they know that they've had it, particularly frontline care staff. But from a modelling perspective, testing allows us to check whether our models are working. Are our predictions accurate? And it enables us as well to get a better estimate of the key parameters that underpin those models. So numbers like R0 we can estimate much better if we have better testing, especially early on in the outbreak. If we have better testing, we have better models. If we have better models, we can implement better long-term sustainable policies. Again, There will be a link to this article if you want to read and find out a little bit more. So how does the testing work? Well, there are two approaches. The first looks for the virus itself, so it tells you whether you are infected at the time in which you provide a sample. And this approach just uses something called polymerase chain reaction. A lot of you will be familiar with this. It's a standard genetic procedure that looks for a piece of the virus's RNA, makes lots of copies of it, and enables us to visualize it. So that is a standard procedure that we routinely carry out at universities. The reagents, there's nothing complex there with that. The second approach looks for an immune response to the virus. So that's what you might hear about serological testing. That is still in development, but that could potentially be very powerful because it will tell us whether or not an individual has had the disease. And that again is very important for things like the predictions being made by the Oxford model. We can better estimate certain parameters like rho if we can estimate what proportion of the population are likely to have had the disease. So I'll just finish off with a few personal opinions about going forward. So in my opinion, open science has never been more important than now with this case. So one thing that's been a bit of an issue at times is that it's not been ultra transparent exactly how policies, particularly with the UK government, have been based on science, models and data. So good open science involves sharing models, sharing code, and also being transparent about how those models are turned into policy. And I think a spirit of openness would be very much welcomed going forward. I think another key element is that we need to back up models with data, and the best way that we can do that is through testing. So I really hope that there'll be more testing as of now, so that we can better predict and better manage the disease. Okay, that's it from me. I hope it's been informative. If you have any questions, you can get in touch with me. Please feel free to use the slides and the information and everything within here, however you see fit. Thanks very much. Bye.